The first thing my mother said to me at my grandfather's funeral was, "The caterers used the service entrance." She didn't know I was standing there holding the proof of a $1.2 billion inheritance, and that by sunset, her five-star lifestyle was going to completely collapse. She thought she was laying a dying old man to rest. She had no idea he'd set a trap, and I was holding the key. The first thing my mother said to me at my grandfather's funeral was, "The caterers used the service entrance." She didn't say hello. She didn't ask how the drive was. She took one look at my off-the-rack black dress, the foil-wrapped tray in my hands, and mapped out my exact place in the hierarchy. Behind her, 4 stories of polished limestone caught the pale morning light. The Braithwaite estate looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum for old money. "I brought Grandpa's photographs," I said. Leslie Braithwaite Anderson didn't blink. At 59, my mother operated under the firm belief that every room was a stage and she was the main attraction. She stood there in a tailored designer suit, a diamond brooch pinned to her lapel, hair frozen in place with hairspray. Even her grief looked rehearsed. "Leave them in the library," she said, her voice dropping an octave as a couple strolled past. "And try not to wander. Important people are here, important people." That was her word for anyone who wasn't me. My brother stepped out from behind a marble pillar, swirling ice in a crystal tumbler at 9 in the morning. At 36, Brandon wore entitlement like a second skin. He squinted down at the tray. "What's under the foil?" "Photographs." He lifted the edge anyway. On top was a Polaroid of Grandpa Arthur and me at his kitchen table from 3 Christmases ago. He had his reading glasses crooked on his nose, holding a solar calculator, while I was doubled over laughing at some note he'd scribbled on a legal pad. Brandon's mouth twitched into a smirk. "Of course, bringing proof you actually visited." "I brought memories." "Same difference," he muttered. My mother let out a soft, theatrical sigh. "Not today, Brandon." It sounded like a reprimand, but it wasn't. It was just permission with manners. I brushed past them and walked into the library without another word. That was the script we'd been rehearsing my whole life. Brandon jabbed, my mother watched, and I absorbed the hit. I was 34, running my own tax practice, paying my own mortgage, but 5 minutes in that house turned me right back into a teenager. The difficult one. The disappointing one. The library smelled of cedar, old paper, and lemon oil. I set the tray on a side table and started laying out the prints along the mantelpiece. Arthur Braithwaite on a mud-slicked construction site in 1978. Arthur breaking ground on an industrial park. Arthur as a young man, a cylinder of blueprints tucked under his arm. The business rags always called his fortune mysterious because he hated giving interviews, but the math was plain enough. Braithwaite Holdings owned commercial strips, medical parks, timberland, and farmland spread across 4 states. The last Forbes estimate pinned his net worth at $1.2 billion. My family treated that number like the weather. They checked it, talked about it, built their lives around it. Grandpa never mentioned it. "A number is just a shadow," he told me once over a cup of diner coffee. "It doesn't tell you what cast it. Income can mask a theft. Debt can hide a blowhard. A healthy profit margin can hide a body." He'd peered over his glasses at me. "That's why I'd rather talk to an accountant than a salesman." I'd laughed. "Accountants lie too, Grandpa." "Sure," he said, "but a good one knows where the blood shows through the ink." My mother delivered the eulogy. She stood under a giant oil painting of Grandpa, her voice cracking at all the right pauses as she described a devoted patriarch who lived solely for his family. I sat in the 3rd row, watching the back of Brandon's neck. He sat up front next to my father, accepting nods from board members as if the building were already his. No one mentioned that Grandpa hadn't spoken to any of them in over a year. No one mentioned that Brandon only showed up when his liquid assets ran dry. And nobody said a word about the blowout 6 months ago, when Grandpa froze my parents' access to an estate account after catching $400,000 in charges for jewelry and charter flights. They certainly didn't mention that I had spent every Tuesday evening with him for 3 years. Not to iron his shirts or manage his pills, but just to sit at his kitchen table with a deck of cards and a pot of tea. After the service, the house filled with loud laughter expensive perfume, and low-toned conversations that dead-ended whenever I walked by. Over by the sideboard, I caught Brandon talking to two executives from the commercial real estate branch. "I'll be restructuring senior management once probate clears," Brandon was saying, rattling the ice in his glass. One of the executives caught my eye over Brandon's shoulder. Brandon turned, saw me, and gave a dismissive wave. "Don't mind her. My sister does small business taxes." I kept walking. My firm handled tax strategies for regional manufacturers and a 40-site medical group, but Brandon needed my world to stay tiny. It made his feel bigger. At 4 o'clock, a paralegal from the estate attorney's firm started quietly pulling family members aside. My mother straightened her spine, ordered fresh coffee, and Brandon poured himself 3 fingers of scotch. I figured I was being kept around for something small, Grandpa's old mechanical adding machine, maybe, or his set of fountain pens. We filed into the library at 5:15. Samuel Prescott was waiting behind Grandpa's heavy mahogany desk. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, with the dry, unbothered posture of a man who made a very good living off other people's bad tempers. My mother went straight for Grandpa's leather armchair. Samuel didn't look up from his file. "Mrs. Anderson, please leave that seat empty." Her smile froze. "I'm his daughter." "I'm aware," Samuel said, and that was his chair. She stiffened and sat on the sofa instead. Brandon slumped into an armchair beside her, while my father took the other end of the couch. I grabbed a wooden straight-backed chair near the shelves. Samuel opened a thick folder. Arthur executed his final will and testament on February 12th. He completed the corresponding trust amendments and corporate transfer directives at the same time. "Skip the preamble, Samuel," my mother said, tapping a manicured fingernail against her handbag. "Just read the allocations." Samuel looked at her over his reading glasses for a long, quiet moment. Then he began. He went through the smaller bequests first: lump sums for his housekeeper and driver, an endowed chair at the university, land donated to the county hospital. Then he turned a page. "Regarding the residuary estate," Samuel said, his voice flat and steady, "to my granddaughter, Michelle Anderson, I leave all remaining personal and real property, controlling corporate shares, trust assets, intellectual property, and voting rights without division." The mantel clock ticked. Once. Twice, my mother let out a high, incredulous bark of a laugh. "I'm sorry, what percentage?" "All remaining assets," Samuel said. Brandon sat up, his glass sloshing over his knuckles. "You mean she's the trustee?" "No. She manages the distributions?" "No." Samuel folded his hands over the paper. "Michelle is the sole beneficiary and controlling successor of Braithwaite Holdings." My mother stood up so fast her coffee cup hit the tray, dark liquid sloshing across the saucer. "That is absurd. That's legally impossible." "It's entirely legal," Samuel said. "I am his daughter?" "Yes." "Brandon is his only grandson?" "Yes." "And she?" My mother thrust a sharp finger in my direction. "She's a tax preparer who lived in a rented studio until she was 30. A strange, cold quiet settled in my chest. Samuel turned another page in the binder. "Arthur assumed you would react this way." Brandon was on his feet now, his face red. "What is that supposed to mean?" Samuel read directly from the document. "Any relative contesting this instrument should understand that my decision was deliberate. I have judged my heirs not by their bloodline or their expectations, but by their actions." My mother's jaw went tight. She knew that phrasing. It was the same tone Grandpa used right before he cut off an unproductive loan. "I leave the balance of my estate to Michelle," Samuel read on, "because she asked for nothing, hid nothing, and treated me like a human being while the rest of you treated me like an annuity waiting to mature." Brandon's glass slipped out of his hand, sinking into the thick carpet without breaking. My mother rounded on me. "What did you do to him?" "Nothing," I said. "Don't lie to me." "I didn't know about this, Mom. I swear I didn't." "You expect us to believe he handed $1 billion to a 34-year-old accountant and you had no idea?" She took 2 steps toward me. My father reached out and caught her sleeve. "Leslie, don't." She shoved his hand away, her eyes locked on mine. "You sat in that kitchen with him every week. What did you tell him?" "I didn't tell him anything," I said, meeting her gaze. "I listened to him." That look came over her face, the pale, sharp-edged fury I'd spent my childhood trying to avoid. But sitting in that chair, I realized something. She didn't hate me because I'd stolen her money. She hated me because Grandpa had seen right through her and he'd chosen me anyway. By Friday, the gloves were off. My phone hadn't stopped buzzing with texts from aunts, uncles, and second cousins I hadn't seen since high school graduation. Some were offering unsolicited legal advice. Most were dropping subtle hints about old family debts Grandpa had promised to cover. I didn't want a war. I knew how vicious my family could be, but a naive part of me thought they'd backed off once the ink was dry. So I called a meeting at Samuel's office and laid out an offer, $2 million each, $6 million total. Clean break, no admissions, no ongoing litigation, no access to the companies. Enough for all three of them to live comfortably if they didn't go buying yachts. My father looked at the paperwork, then at my mother. He looked tired. Brandon just sneered. $2 million. Out of $1 billion? It's $2 million more than Grandpa left you, I said. My mother pushed the paper back across the mahogany table with the tip of her pen. You think you can buy us off with crumbs from our own table? It isn't your table, Mom. It was until you spent 3 years whispering in an old man's ear. She leaned back, folding her arms. You really think you're qualified to run Braithwaite Holdings? You have no idea what you just stepped into. I know the math, I said. You know spreadsheets, she spat back. You inherited a target on your back, companies that will swallow you whole, and a family that will make sure every day of your life is lived in a courtroom. We'll see what a probate judge says about undue influence. 3 days later, they hired a firm out of City Center known for dragging out trust disputes until the estate dried up. A week after that, the first video dropped online. It was a grainy 10-second audio clip uploaded to an anonymous social media account. My voice, clearly identifiable, saying, "You can't keep paying for their lives. You need to cut them off." Out of context, it sounded like a scheming relative isolating an old man. In reality, we had been talking about Brandon using a corporate line of credit to pay off his personal gambling debts in Atlantic City. But the internet didn't care about the backstory. Within 24 hours, the clip had 2 million views. Morning talk shows picked it up. Strangers started leaving comments on my firm's Google review page, calling me a elder-abusing leech. Brandon did an interview on the local news standing right outside the courthouse steps, looking slick in a gray suit. My grandfather was frail, he told the cameras, his voice dripping with performative sorrow. He was isolated. We just want justice for Arthur. I sat in my lawyer's office, watching the broadcast on a wall-mounted monitor. Renee Caldwell paused the screen on Brandon's face. "Don't get mad," Renee said. She was a 50-something litigation partner with sharp gray eyes and the quiet demeanor of a surgeon. "Mad makes you sloppy." "He's lying," I said, my knuckles white against my coffee cup. "Of course he is," Renee said, leaning back in her leather chair. "Public relations is cheap. Evidence is expensive. Let them waste their money on media buys. We build the ledger." That phrase grounded me. A smear campaign is just like a cooked set of books. It looks convincing until you demand the receipts. You follow the paper trail. You check the entry dates. You find who signed off on the balance. At the first probate hearing, Renee didn't bother arguing with their media circus. She brought 3 things: Grandpa's signed will, a video recorded by Samuel the morning of the signing, and an affidavit from 2 independent neurologists confirming Grandpa was entirely sound of mind. On the courtroom monitor, Grandpa looked small in his armchair, but his voice didn't wobble. "Why Michelle?" Samuel's recorded voice asked off-screen. "Because Michelle knows what $1 is worth," Grandpa said into the camera. "The rest of them only know how to spend it." My mother sat at the defense table, her mouth pressed into a line so thin it turned white. The judge ruled in our favor on the temporary injunction, freezing all corporate assets and shutting down my family's access to the family allowance accounts pending trial. That was the turning point. For 30 years, my parents and Brandon had lived off Arthur Braithwaite's cash flow like it was tap water. The country club dues, the Mercedes leases, the house in the Keys, the endless seed money for Brandon's failed tech startups, it all ran through estate clearings. Now, the tap was off. 48 hours later, they produced the codicil. It was a single sheet of cream stationery with Grandpa's embossed initials at the top, dated 3 days before his death. It allegedly revoked the previous will, split the estate evenly between my mother and Brandon, and explicitly called me emotionally unfit. My mother's lawyer held a press conference right on the courthouse steps to show it off. Renee brought a high-res scan into our briefing room the next morning. "It's sloppy," she said, tracing the signature line with a yellow highlighter. "Is it forged?" I asked. "We'll let a handwriting expert answer that, but look at the paper." It was found, conveniently enough, in an old family Bible in your grandfather's guest bedroom. "My mother hasn't opened a Bible in 40 years, I said. "We hired Dr. Victor Shaw, a forensic document examiner who used to work for the Treasury Department. He took one look at the stationery under magnification and pointed out the tremor lines in the ink. "Your grandfather had a distinct resting tremor in his right hand during his last month," Shaw explained, tapping a photograph of the signature. "This script shows uniform pressure. A person with his medical chart couldn't physically pull off this fluid downstroke, and the ink is a gel formulation that hit the market 6 months ago. Your grandfather used Parker fountain pens exclusively, didn't he?" "Always," I said. "Whoever wrote this used an $8 pen from a pharmacy," Shaw said, sliding the file back to me. "It's not a smart forgery, it's a desperate one." The relief lasted about 12 hours. By Wednesday, my parents changed their strategy again. They filed an emergency petition alleging Grandpa had been on high-dose narcotics and sedatives during his final days, rendering him incapable of revoking the forged codicil even if he wanted to. Attached to the filing was a stack of pharmacy records showing prescriptions written by a doctor I'd never heard of. The next morning, my private investigator called. Colin Reeves had been working for us for 2 weeks, digging into the origin of the prescription records. When I answered, his voice was tight. "I'm dropping the contract, Michelle. I sent the retainer balance back to your lawyer." "What? Why?" "Someone dropped a manila envelope on my wife's car this morning," Colin said, his voice dropping low. "It had photos of my 10-year-old daughter walking into her school." A cold weight dropped into my stomach. "Colin, I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry," he said flatly. "Just get out of that apartment. These people aren't playing probate games anymore." He hung up. 2 hours later, my personal address was leaked on a local forum. By 6 o'clock, half a dozen people were standing outside my apartment building, holding printed signs calling me a thief. A guy with a live stream rig followed me into the underground garage, screaming questions through my driver's side window while I tried to park. The building manager called my apartment at 8. He was polite, but clear. The other tenants were nervous, and security couldn't keep the sidewalk clear. I packed 2 suitcases, threw them in the trunk of my sedan, and drove out to Grandpa's estate. The main house was dark when I pulled up the long driveway. Without the staff or the dinner parties, 4 stories of limestone felt vast and hollow. I spent the first 2 nights sleeping in one of the second-floor guest rooms, jumping at every creak of the floorboards. On the 3rd night, unable to sleep, I went down to Grandpa's main office on the ground floor. The room had already been searched by the estate auditors, but Grandpa was an old-school operator. He didn't trust filing cabinets, and he certainly didn't trust cloud storage. "A safe is just a sign that tells a burglar where to look," he told me once. I started checking behind the artwork along the south wall. Behind a framed land survey from 1982, I found 4 fine scratch marks in the wood paneling. I pulled the frame down. A small, flush-mounted digital keypad was set into the plaster. I used the birth date of his first business, a number he used for everything, and the lock clicked open. Inside was a black, ruggedized external hard drive wrapped in a piece of lined notebook paper. Written across the front in Grandpa's blocky handwriting, "Michelle, numbers only tell the truth when the source records survive. AB." I brought the drive over to the desk, plugged it into my laptop, and hit the prompt. A password box popped up with a hint line, "First deficit." I didn't even have to think about it. When I was 16, he gave me a ledger for an apartment building he owned in the city and told me he'd give me $50 if I found out why the cash flow didn't match the lease count. I spent 6 hours finding an unregistered lease on Unit 3C where the manager was pocketing $875 a month in cash. I typed in 875. The drive unlocked. It contained a single folder filled with time-stamped video files. Grandpa had installed a hidden security camera inside the smoke detector above his bed during his last 6 months. I clicked the first file, dated 3 months before he died. The video opened on Grandpa sitting up in bed, looking frail in a flannel shirt. My mother walked into the frame holding a plastic medicine cup. "What's that?" Grandpa asked on screen. "Just something to help you rest, Dad," my mother said smoothly. "I took my evening pills an hour ago." Doctor. Vance added this to the chart today. I didn't talk to Vance today. My mother stepped closer, her voice soft, condescending. "You're getting confused again, Dad. Just take it." I scrubbed forward 2 weeks. In another clip, Brandon was standing at the nightstand, crushing 2 white tablets with the back of a spoon and dumping the powder into a cup of pudding while my father stood near the door, looking nervously down the hallway. "Is Vance sure about the dosage?" my father asked, his voice low. "Vance does what we pay him to do," Brandon said without looking up. "Keep your voice down." I sat back, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it was difficult to breathe. I clicked through to a file dated 10 days before Grandpa died. Brandon was sitting at the small table in the corner of the bedroom, tracing Grandpa's signature onto a sheet of cream stationery using a Lightbox app on his phone. My mother was standing beside him, pointing at the stroke line. "Make the broader," she said. "He always drags the crossbar." "It's fine," Brandon snapped. "Nobody's going to look at it that closely once the probate judge sees the medical records." "Michelle will," my mother said. Brandon let out a sharp laugh. "What's she going to do?" "Audit us." "Michelle won't be in a position to audit anyone," my mother said, her voice completely cool. "Once Vance's psychiatric evaluation goes into the record, we're filing for a conservatorship over her assets too. A woman who isolates a dying man clearly isn't mentally sound." I stopped the video. The room was deathly quiet except for the hum of the HVAC unit. They hadn't just forged a will. They'd spent months over-medicating him to build a paper trail of dementia, and they were planning to use that same paper trail to destroy me if I fought back. The last file on the drive was a direct video recorded by Grandpa himself, 2 weeks before he lost the ability to speak. He was sitting close to the lens, his face drawn, holding the camera controller in his trembling right hand. "Michelle," he said, his voice a low rasp. "If you're watching this, it means they couldn't wait." He stopped to catch his breath, his chest heaving slightly under his robe. "I didn't tell you about the changes to the estate because I didn't want your visits turned into a circus. You came here because you cared about the old man, not the accounts. I made a lot of mistakes with your mother. I gave her money when I should have given her rules. I paid off Brandon's messes because it was easier than watching him go to jail." He leaned closer to the lens. "Generosity without accountability is just funding bad behavior. Don't carry their balance, Michelle. Let them pay their own bill. We didn't take the hard drive straight to the local police. Renee knew better than that. She called in a former federal prosecutor she worked with, and we spent 48 hours making digital forensically verified copies, locking down the original drive in a bank vault, and pulling the complete medical records for the doctor my mother had hired off the books. The State Police Financial Crimes Unit opened a file immediately, but the prosecutor wanted a clean, undeniable collar. They wanted an active attempt at extortion on record to tie the whole package together. We gave my family exactly what they were looking for, an opening. Renee sent a formal letter to my mother's counsel stating that I was overwhelmed by the press coverage and was prepared to discuss a settlement relinquishing my claim to the estate in exchange for a full liability release and a public retraction. My mother took the bait in less than 15 minutes. She insisted the signing happen at the main estate house. She wanted to stand in Grandpa's library and take it back in person. They showed up at 6 o'clock on a rainy Thursday evening. My mother was wearing a cream-colored wool coat, not black this time. She looked like she was walking into a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Brandon came in right behind her, taking off his wet suit jacket and tossing it over the back of Grandpa's leather armchair. Their attorney laid a thick stack of settlement documents on the coffee table. "I'm glad reason prevailed," my mother said, stepping toward the fireplace. She didn't look at me, she looked around the room like she was already measuring it for new curtains. "You were always out of your depth, Michelle." "I just want it finished," I said, keeping my voice quiet, flat. "It will be," Brandon said, picking up a pen from the desk. "Sign the release and we'll drop the petitions by morning." "Before I sign," I said, reaching for the TV remote on the mantel, "there's one thing you should look at." I pressed play. The 65-inch monitor above the hearth flickered to life. My mother's face filled the screen, holding the pill cup over Grandpa's bed. "Just something to help you rest, Dad." The room went dead silent. Brandon dropped the pen. My mother froze, her hand still reaching for her coat pocket. I didn't pause the tape. It rolled right into the next clip. Brandon at the light box, tracing the signature onto the cream paper. Then the audio of my mother discussing the conservatorship petition to have me committed. My father sat down heavily on the edge of the sofa, his mouth open, staring at the screen like he'd seen a ghost. "Turn that off," my mother whispered. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a strange, sharp rattle to it. "Turn it off." Renee stepped out from the adjoining dining room, followed immediately by 2 state troopers and a detective in a gray suit. "Leslie Braithwaite Anderson," the detective said, pulling a folded warrant from his interior pocket. "Brandon Anderson, Richard Anderson." "Keep your hands where we can see them." Brandon backed up 2 steps toward the window, his eyes wide. "Wait a minute, hold on. This is a family matter. This is a civil dispute. It was a civil dispute until you forged a legal document and administered controlled substances without a prescription," the detective said, stepping forward with handcuffs out. "Hands behind your back." My mother didn't look at the police. She looked at me, her eyes burning with a raw, ugly hate that made her look 10 years older in an instant. "You trapped us," she breathed. "Grandpa trapped you," I said. "He just left me the key." She made a sudden, frantic lunge for the laptop sitting on the console table below the TV, her nails scraping across the wood as she tried to grab the display wire. One of the troopers caught her by the arms, wrestling her back against the side table. She started screaming then, not words, just a loud, breathless sound of sheer rage as the iron clicked around her wrists. My father didn't fight. He just sat on the couch with his head in his hands, weeping quietly as they pulled him up by his elbows. The criminal trials dragged on for 8 months, but the civil fight ended that night. With the video evidence and the medical records locked into the court record, the probate judge formally rejected the forged codicil, validated Arthur Braithwaite's original will, and issued a permanent order barring my family from ever touching estate funds. My father took a deal early on, pleading guilty to conspiracy in exchange for testifying against my mother and Brandon. It got him 3 years of probation and an ankle monitor. He lives in a small rented condo in Tampa now, surviving on a modest pension he earned before he joined the family business. I haven't spoken to him since the sentencing. Brandon got 7 years at a state correctional facility for forgery, evidence tampering, and corporate fraud. My mother got 12. She refused every plea offer the state threw at her, insisting to the end that a daughter couldn't steal from her own father. At her sentencing hearing, she sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, her hair unstyled, looking small and gray under the fluorescent lights. When given the chance to speak, she told the judge that I had ruined the family out of lifelong envy. The judge didn't even look up from his papers. "Mrs. Anderson," he said dryly, "the evidence shows you ruined your family with a gel pen and a bottle of sedatives. After the legal dust settled, I sold the limestone estate to a historic preservation trust. It was too big, too cold, and too full of ghosts. I kept my tax practice. I like the work. I like sitting down with small business owners, looking at their books, and helping them figure out how to keep their doors open. The $1.2 billion sits in a structured foundation now, managed by a professional board of trustees with strict compliance rules. No single person has absolute draw power, especially not me. Every now and then, people ask me if I feel guilty about how it all landed. I think about that Polaroid from the funeral tray, the one of Grandpa and me sitting at his kitchen table with his solar calculator and a yellow pad. I keep it framed on my desk at work now. Grandpa was right about the numbers. They don't lie, but they don't spare your feelings either. My family spent 30 years building up a massive deficit of cruelty, vanity, and greed, fully convinced someone else would always cover the check. I didn't ruin them, I just stopped paying their bill.